Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, as the case may be. Uh, Welcome to the Cold War. Okay, today we're going to be discussing a specific part of the Cold War called Korea. Korea is a country in Southeast Asia, and it's a peninsula. For those of you who study geography, a peninsula means it's like this piece of land that sticks out into the water. It's got water on three sides. Good example of a peninsula would be Florida, the state of Florida, or the country of Italy, or the country of Greece. If you know those countries, they stick out in the Mediterranean. Florida sticks out in the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. Well, Korea is like that, but it sticks out in the China Sea. It's on in Asia. So we have this country that is being dominated and has been conquered by the Japanese. Remember the Japanese in World War II. And so after World War II, the Japanese are gone. Obviously, we win the war. And so we have this country left to itself to come up with a type of government because prior to that, they were being monopolized or governed by the Japanese because the Japanese had conquered Korea. Here's where we get into problems with these new countries that are surfacing after World War II. Remember, World War II was fought in Europe, but some of the allies, some of the countries that fought in World War II were imperialist nations. They had empires. For example, England owned India and they owned parts of Africa. And so during World War II, they called on their colonies. We used to be a colony of England until we got our independence. But during World War II, England still had colonies. And so when they were fighting the Germans, they called on their colonies to help them out. Hey, you're part of this club, of this empire we call the British Empire. We need your help. We're getting our butts kicked over here by the Germans. So send men and send material to help us fight the Germans. And so India sent people, and so did all the other colonies, Australia and South Africa. All these colonies that belong to England send people, they send soldiers, they send resources to fight in World War II and help out their mother country. You guessed it, England. All right. Once the war is over, these countries start to ask the question, it's time for us to separate from the mother country. We want to be our own country. We want to have our own government. Uh, India wanted to do this. And so, with the help of Gandhi, they finally gained their independence. So did Egypt. So did, South Africa. And so did other colonies that the British Empire owned. The question now is, what ideology do we choose? Because remember, after the end of World War II, there are two major ideologies in the world. You have communism and you have what? Capitalism. And so these countries have a brand new clean slate. They're going to start their country. What government do we choose? They study Karl Marx's Communism and the Communist Manifesto. They study democracy and capitalism from the United States. And they have to come up with some kind of governing body that's going to take care of them. So, because the mother country doesn't control them anymore. India is not being controlled by the British Empire. They're not controlled by the Queen or the House of Commons or the House of Lords or the British Parliament or the Prime Minister. They have their own country and they're going to have to make a decision. Well, something like this happens to Korea. Korea is being given a new lease on life. You people in Korea are free. The Japanese are no longer controlling you because we won the war and we kicked them out. So, excuse me, you guys decide what it is that you want to do. The United States kind of hands off because we believe in people to some degree make their own decisions. We believe in the right of people to decide what they want to do. And so we have these two ideologies in the world, and people are trying to decide, well, you're never going to have everybody agree on one thing. And this is what you see. In Korea, you have those that want communism and you have those that want capitalism. All right. And so those that want communism are in the north of the Korean Peninsula, and I'll show you that later on a map. And those who want capitalism are in the south part of Korea, of this peninsula, if you will. All right. So we're going to have to make a decision. There are elections held for this new government they want, but the elections don't go out as well as they wanted to. And the communist faction within this new country called Korea want to be communist, and they're going to do everything they can to be communist. We have people that are supporting them. You have, again, these two ideologies in the form of Captain America being the United States versus the Soviet guy. He's a big old bully. You can see that the way they've got him drawn in this cartoon. So what led to the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was this difference in ideologies and the emergence of these new countries all over the world after World War II who had become independent and had to make a decision as to what it was that they wanted to be. So in what we're going to see is that in these countries, you start having factions of each ideology start to quarrel, start to argue, and eventually they start fighting each other. You have civil war. What is a civil war? It's a war inside a country. The same we had one in 1860, 1861 through 1865. We had the American Civil War, and we all know about that one between the North and the South. But it was fought by Americans with Americans against Americans. It was all right here in the United States. Now you're having the same thing happening, not for slavery like we did in World War, or excuse me, in the Civil War, but for what kind of ideology we want to govern us in our country. And so we have that in Korea. And so we have a civil war in Korea. We have the North, which is being uh, sponsored or helped by the communists because that's the ideology that they want. And then you have the South Koreans, which is being sponsored and helped by the United States. Now, the United States and Russia or the Soviet Union don't come together in a confrontation with each other. Why? Why don't they do that? Well, we saw before, and let's go back to the other slide. It's very simple. Look at what the cartoon says. No accounting. Oh no. Account to be used because the enemy might retaliate. In other words, if we're going to use, now is when we both have nuclear weapons, and we talked about nuclear weapons. Nobody wins in a nuclear war. So look, instead of using these huge bombs that they have, this big arsenal of nuclear weapons, what are they fighting with? Arrows. Well, why? Because arrows is the old way to fight, and you're not going to destroy the whole world. So this is a deterrence. This new weapon is kind of holding people back from committing a big mistakes and calling it World War III. We're having the same problem now in these countries like Korea, who's having a civil war, and they're being sponsored by these two large nations. They're not going to go at it because of this little country who's trying to decide what ideology. They're not going to go at it. The huge countries that are sponsoring each side, they're going to let them fight it out in Korea. But they are going to go in there and they're going to help. The United States is going to help the capitalist side of South Korea, and the Soviet Union is going to help the communist side, North Korea, with conventional weapons. They're not going to give them nuclear bombs because we all know what happens when they get nuclear bombs. So they're going to be back and forth, and it gets to the point where we actually send soldiers into Korean Peninsula, into South Korea, and therefore there we go. It is the Korean War, and it started in 1950 when the North attacked the South. The communists came down from the north. They crossed the 38th parallel, and which is an imaginary line across the Korean Peninsula, and push the the capitalists or the democratic Koreans south, south, south. And so they got to the point where they had their backs to the ocean, and they raised their hand and they said, "Guys, we need help." That's when it kicks in. That's when the United States says, this is unfair. So we're going to go in there and we're going to help the South Koreans, the guys that are on our side, the guys that think of the way we do. They want the same, then they have the same ideology that we do. They don't want to be communists. So if they want to be, we should give them the opportunity to be capitalist or democracy. So we send people there and we have this tit for tat where we have, these people fighting back and forth with the help of the superpowers. Okay? This is what the Korean War is all about. And you can see that the U.S. response to the fall of China was more aggressively confronting communism in the war. Now, the cartoon represents the USSR, the Soviet Union, the the United States, or the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic, which is Russia. Okay, and you can see the arrows. In Russia, you're always going to see Russia being represented. Their mascot is the bear. So whenever I say the bear, you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the Soviet Union. When I say the eagle, who are we talking about? Or Uncle Sam? You got it. The United States. So here we see the bear, Russia, going in the arrows and spreading out. They're spreading down to Africa. They're spreading out to Western Europe. They're spreading out to Syria and Afghanistan and China and Thailand and Korea. They're helping you. They want to spread their ideology around the world. And President Truman says, you know what? It's not going to happen. We're not going to allow it. And so we have a President Truman has this policy that says, you know what? We are going to, any country that asks for help from being taken over by a communist society or a communist ideology, all they got to do is ask us. And we'll be in there like white on rice, man. We're going to be in there helping them. And so everywhere this ugly bear raises his head, anywhere in the world, and the country is divided, the capitalist side or the democratic side is going to ask for our help, and the communist side is going to ask for either China, a communist China, or the Soviet Union's help. Okay, so the USA was afraid of a domino theory in which communist nations turn their people, or the nations turn to communism. What are we talking about, Mr. Sordo? Domino theory. The domino is a game that I play at home. Okay, so let's think about that. How many of you have ever lined up the dominoes? One next to each other. You stand them up like you see here on the cartoon, and what happens when you touch the first one and it starts to collapse and fall over, and it starts knocking the other ones down? Well, this is called the domino theory. Okay, and this is what Truman is saying. If China falls, it's going to fall on Korea, and then Korea is going to fall, and then Vietnam, and then Laos, and it's going to trickle down, and all the dominoes are going to fall, and they're all going to become communists. We cannot allow that. The United States is not going to stand for that. Okay, we're not going to let that happen. Unfortunately, the Truman Doctrine says those countries that are already communist, okay, time out. You can stay communist, but we're going to put a big lid on this pot called communism, and we're not going to let it escape out of this boiling pot into the world and become. No, we're going to contain it. What do you do when you're cooking a pot of menudo on your stove? Ask your grandma, ask your mom, and it starts to boil, and all the steam is coming out, and it's spilling all over the ring. You put a lid on it. You contain it. You don't let it spill over and cause a mess. Okay, so this is basically what the United States is saying. We're going to put a lid on this pot called communism, and we're not going to let it spread out. We're not going to have dominoes falling all over the place. Okay, this is what it's about. So as a result, the United States vows, they pledge, to contain it. we're going to cap it. We're not going to allow communism to spread all over the place. And so it acts on the communist threat in Korea when the North Koreans, who are the communists, start to take over the South Korea, and so the United States says, we're not going to let it happen. We're going to put a stop to it. So we send troops, and we send on the army, we send the Marines in there, we send everybody in there to try to stop this onslaught of North Korean communists from taking over the whole country. The leader of our American forces in Korea is a guy by the name of Douglas MacArthur. Now he's got an issue. This guy is very, very, very flamboyant. Okay, what is flamboyant? I'll give you a perfect example. Donald Trump is flamboyant, okay? You can see he's always got his hair really nice. He poses a certain way. He has crews taking his picture. He sets up things. This is a flamboyant person, a big show off, okay? And so this guy, Douglas MacArthur, who's a general of the American forces in South Korea, fighting with the communists, he's in there and he is saying, you know what, we're going to push him back. And he does. We push them all the way back up the peninsula of Korea to the border with China. And then the Chinese, who are communists, are going, time out. You're getting too close, MacArthur. You better back off because if you cross the Yalu River, you're into the Chinese territory. And we're not going to allow that. So now the Chinese get into this battle and they start sending troops down to Korea. And this thing is starting to escalate and snowball into a bigger issue. Now, some of you are out there saying escalate, and all these words that Mr. Sordo is saying. What the heck are you talking about, Mr. Sordo? You're losing us. Well, escalate. Think about it. What does that mean? You ever go to the mall and they got this thing and there's stairs, right? And you stand on it and it takes you to the second floor. You don't even have to walk up the. What is this thing called? You're right. An escalator, right? You see the analogy here? Escalator is going to take you up, is going to increase, it's going to get bigger. And this is where the escalation of the Korean War begins. When we get involved with China, China jumps into this thing, and now this is really getting to get wrapped around the axle, all right? And that's another term that means it's getting big. Well, MacArthur's got this bright idea. See, he says, okay, if the Chinese get involved in this, you know what? They don't have a nuclear bomb. We'll just nuke them. We'll just use the same nuclear bombs that we used in Japan in World War II, and that'll be the end of it. Because someday these Chinese are going to get pretty powerful. We might as well take care of them right now. So I'm going to drop the bomb on them. We got a problem now, okay? Because back in the United States, President Truman is the commander and chief of the military. This is in our government. The military is not run by a military guy. It's run by the president. He is a civilian. He might have been in the military, maybe, but he's no longer in the military. He's a civilian. He doesn't wear a uniform. He controls the military. And so President Truman is afraid that if we escalate, remember the word, this thing gets bigger, then the Russians are going to get in because, after all, they're also communists, and we're going to get into World War III. So President Truman tells Douglas, hey, Dougie, you know what? I know what you want to do, but it ain't going to happen, dude. We're not going to use a nuclear bomb here. We're going to do what we can with what we got because this thing could get wrapped around the axle pretty quick and we can become World War III. And so MacArthur insists, and he insists that's what he's going to do. And very simple. Truman fires him. He kicks him out. He says, you what? You're going to do what? I'm the president. I'm your commander in chief. You know what? Get the hell out of there. I don't want you in there with our forces telling them what to do and to even think about using a nuclear bomb. So MacArthur is relieved of his duty. He's a famous guy, all right? During World War II, he was a commander of the Allied forces in the Pacific. We talked about that a little bit. But, Again, General MacArthur, you got to do a little bit more study on him. He's not my favorite general. Um, and your teachers can tell you why, but I'm not going to get into it because we don't have any more time. But President Truman does it. He does it. He kicks him out. He says, get your butt out of there. And the Korean War continues, but with the promise that we're not going to let the communists take over the South. Okay? So in 1950, here it is. Here's the peninsula I was telling you about. You see, it's a big piece of land that sticks out like a sore thumb out into the Yellow Sea and the Pacific Ocean. Okay, and here is the dividing line. You see this red line right across here? That is the somewhat what is called the 38th parallel. Now, here we go again, Mr. Sordo. What the heck are you talking about? What is this 38th parallel BS that you're telling us? We don't know what that is. I'm going to tell you. Look at the map. If you look real close right here, this blue line, that is a parallel. That's a latitude line. It's a grid line that navigation uses, in the world to tell you where you are in a map. Okay, if the lines cross, you're in this parallel with this longitude, latitude. It kind of tells you, like GPS, and then you know where you're at in reference to whatever it is you're looking at. So look what it says. 30. I know it's hard to see, but it says right here, 38th parallel. So you can see that this is the line of demarcation. Okay, here we go again, Mr. Sordo. What the heck is demarcation? It's just a term that says this is what determines what this line is. There is no blue line out there, okay? It's only drawn on the map so that you can see and you can have a reference point. If you look at these little maps over here, you see it. There it is. That blue line there, that blue line there, that blue line. That is the dividing line. That is the line of demarcation between what? The North and the South. Okay, and there it is. You can see it right there. North Korea, right there in the South. And the capital is Pyongyang. And then you have South Korea, and their capital is Seoul. Two different countries in the same country. Just like when we had our Civil War. We had the North with a capital in Washington, D.C., and you had the Southern states with a capital in Richmond, Virginia. You had two presidents. You had President Lincoln in the North, and you had the Confederate president in the South, and they stayed in their own uh, capitals. So same thing, but we're not fighting here for slavery like we did in our war. We're fighting again slavery and not slavery, two different ideologies. Here we go back. Go back to this thing, ideology. What does ideology mean? They're ideas. Ideology. Ideology is means the study of. So the study of ideas is what ideology means. Okay. So now you have these two countries that are fighting over this ideology. What do I want to be? I want to be communist. No, I want to be capitalist. No, I want to be. You know what? I don't like you because you want to be. No, I don't like you. Boom, and they go at it. They start fighting, and it's a very, very, very bloody war. You could see here at the beginning of the war in this map the kind of orange yellow area. Look how far that's the communists. Look how far they get. They cross the 38th parallel. They drive south, and this little green part here, it's what's left of the capitalists of South Korea. The communists barely, just about, just wiped out. They almost won the war until, this is in 1950, until in September to October of 1950, the United States, with the help of the United Nations, remember, this is that body that they formed, like we talked about after World War II to prevent wars from happening again. They get in there and they push them back. And look, that little green area that was down here before, between September and October, they get together and they drive and they push the northern, the communist forces all the way up. Time out. Because Right there is the border. This is the border. Up here is the border. Let me see if it's in the slide before that. Yeah, you see it here. This is the river right here that separates China, which is communist, from North Korea. So if we're over here pushing up, after they push this down this way, see it's back and forth, and this is what I call tit for tat. In case you don't know what the phrase means, it's one for one or whatever. They're back and forth. They push them all the way back, and look how close they get to the over here. They're already at the border, okay, with China, and that's when the Chinese get involved. And so now, boom, here we go again. The Chinese start sending troops into Korea and helping the North Koreans, just like the South Koreans are being helped by the United States and General MacArthur and winning the war. Now, the Chinese, if you look at the slide way down here, the Chinese are now starting to push down. They're starting to bring it back to the the court. They're on the southern court, and they start. And this is when MacArthur, when the Chinese are pushing the other forces back, this is when MacArthur wants to use a nuclear device, and that's when you know the President Truman says, "No, Douglas, sorry, but you're going to have to get out of there. We're not going to use any nuclear weapons in Korea." Okay? And then finally, on November in 1950 to January 1951, they pushed the Green Troops or the United Nations of the United States all the way back to the 38th parallel, which is where this whole dang thing started. Okay. And so when we get to that point, they're like right there pushing back and forth. The only way one is going to gain advantage over the other is if we use a nuclear device, if we use an atom bomb and we drop it on those people. But that's not going to happen because we know. And so we come to a ceasefire, okay, where we finally say, you know what, that's it. We're not getting anywhere. Communism, why don't we just come to a truce? Why don't we just say, okay, the North can be communist and the South can be capitalist. And that's where we stand today. There was never a peace treaty signed, only a ceasefire saying we're going to stop the fighting at the 38th parallel. The communists are going to stay north of that, and the capitalists or the democracy is going to stay to the south of that. All right. And this is what we to this day. This happened in 1951. Okay. We're talking about, 70 years ago. This war can start tomorrow. Again, if somebody takes a shot at maybe another guy across the line that they have drawn and they kill somebody and it starts to what? Escalate, it starts to grow, we can go into a world war because there was never any agreement signed by either party saying that, we're going to sign the peace. We promise we're not going to pick on each other anymore. No. What happened in 1951 was a ceasefire. They basically said, you know what? We're not going to fight anymore. We're going to stop the fighting. And each side withdrew and went to their own side, and they agreed that the line, the 38th parallel, was going to be the line that nobody was going to cross until they came to some kind of agreement, which for the last 70 years they have not reached the agreement. They are still in the same ceasefire mode. That's why Korea is so important today. You got some crazy guy over there, but the difference now is he's got nuclear bombs. Okay. So the whole thing has really changed. We and the South Korean people are very afraid that the North Koreans are going to cross that 38th parallel again, and this time they're going to use nuclear bombs. Well, if they do, who do you think is going to help the South Koreans with nuclear bombs? You guessed it, the United States. Now the gloves are off and we're in there. And it's going to what? Escalate into a possible nuclear war with China being involved. And when you get into the nuclear war, you know what happens? Nobody wins. Okay, so let's look at this a little more. South Korea appealed to the United Nations and they said, we need help. Send troops over here because to contain, to hold back communism. The United States pushed too close to China. We already discussed that. And the Chinese army entered the war and they started to help the North Koreans. Okay, so after 3 years of fighting, there was a ceasefire, like I told you. And the ceasefire, it was agreed to in 1953 that the fighting would stop at the 38th parallel and was going to be, I can't see the rest of the slide, but uh, restored as soon as they could come to some agreement. The U.S. successfully stopped communism. So, in a way, did we really? Not really. We didn't stop it because it came to like a tie. Okay, nobody got the North Koreans didn't get the whole country, and the South Koreans didn't get the whole country. It was kind of divided, and to this day, Korea is divided into two sections: North being communist and South being uh, democratic or capitalist. Okay, so we stopped it from spreading. We contained it. We put a lid on it. We didn't let that menudo pot boil over, okay? But we didn't stop it. Communism in other places raised its ugly head once more. It raised its ugly head in Vietnam, and you're going to see something similar. It raised its ugly head in Cuba, and it raised its ugly head in all kinds of places during this Cold War period, which is basically what we're seeing. We're seeing these two, again, ideologies come in conflict with one another, okay? So that is, it was willing to fight, and in the United States proved that we're not going to take the domino theory because that's what we believe. We believe that if one country fell, everybody else around it was going to follow, okay? All right, and so I'll leave you with that small video, short video on the Korean conflict or the Korean War that was from 1950, 1951, 52, and 53. They finally ended this thing, but it never did really end it. Okay, it's still a ceasefire. The war is still on. They just promised they were not going to shoot at each other anymore. Okay. Uh, Enough said. All have been said. I wish you happy history, if you will, and we'll stop the video right here.